Good morning to everybody, good afternoon, good evening. I always say this because we don't know where in the world you are. I know just by looking at the names, we've got people who are scattered all across the planet. So a warm welcome to all the old faces and some new names here as well, which is fantastic. This morning we have James and Tore, who's a last minute addition to the lineup. We were going to have Michael, but Tore is our star of the day. They're joining us from Malmo and Copenhagen, respectively. So our Scandinavian friends from days gone by, and they're here to talk about programming and where that could be going in the future, which I think is a very interesting and very poignant moment, especially for our current students on the IDP. And they have a new initiative called Noodle, which will integrate itself into the talk as we progress, as far as I understand, but the talk's not purely about that. So we're very interested to see what took them from A to Noodle. And I will hand over the floor now to James, who will share his screen. But a big warm welcome to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us. And we'll see you at the end for a Q&A.
Great. All right, thank you guys so much. I'm going to move over to presenter mode here, and we've got myself and Tore. So this is quite a title of a talk that we threw together, but we're going to try to keep it pretty lightweight. And as Ali said, we're going to look a little bit into future of programming and what that means for designers. Just by way of intro, this is the two of us. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of the platform Noodle, and we're going to do some demo stuff and hands-on work at the end of today and talk a little bit about where this has come from. And I previously co-founded the design company Top Design and Innovation. We're mostly in Sweden, but also has a presence in San Francisco. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Tore, do you want to say hi and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, my name is Tore. I sit here in Copenhagen and work with James at Noodle, where I'm running the head of design. We were colleagues back at Top as well, where I worked as a UX designer and technologist with a background in interaction design from Malmö University. And I also had the pleasure to work closely with former CIID students and doing both some art projects, for example, Project Alias together with Bjørn Karman, who also studied at CIID back in 2016 or something. So that's my background.
Super. As I mentioned, we worked at a company called Top Design and Innovation, and the reason I bring that up is this is actually where our current endeavor Noodle was started. Within Top, we were fortunate enough to be a team of around 30, and while there, we ended up creating Noodle itself in earlier instances, and we were working with a lot of different large companies like you're seeing here, Nike and IKEA and Samsung and others, but also a lot of startups as well. And they're all looking for new types of interaction paradigms and ways of interacting with our customers and new design of experiences. And this is part of the catalyst of Noodle and part of where a lot of these insights that we're going to share today were first formulated and tested out. And so, if we're looking at where we are today, just by way of transitioning here, we started this company called Noodle, and I started this with a couple of co-founders, and Tore came on board right away. And Noodle is a platform for product designers and developers, innovators who are creating web apps right now and going everywhere, doing everything from prototyping to production and scale with those web apps. And it is largely classified into a space called no-code platforms or low-code platforms. And we'll come back to that before, but this is just a little bit of context for you. As I was saying, we're heads down at Noodle today, and we'll come back to some demos at the end for this platform. But I want to dig right into with Tore here and exploring. For us, I come from a design background myself as well, as most of the people I'm sure on this call, and Tore. And we thought we'd dig right into looking at what are the new materials of digital that we're working with. And so Tore, I'm going to move you along here, and you can speak to this, and we'll do sort of a manual step through.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, so the material of digital is, I think, something we have discussed a lot, both at Noodle and back at Top, because we worked so much with design and technology and that intersection. And I think something we have kind of discussed a lot is this materiality of computation and these more invisible forces that are around it, and what it means to be a designer in that space. Because if you look at some more maybe older or traditional designer types, where it's maybe product design, or it could be designer of a wooden chair, like on the picture here. You, of course, as the designer, you are balancing the aesthetics and the functionality, knowing the material you're working with, but you might not be the one, of course, putting it directly into production or doing the actual production. But as a designer, you need to have some hands-on material and understanding of the material you're working with and its constraints, characteristics, benefits, and weaknesses as well, which is, of course, easily done through hands-on work and kind of a feedback experience with that material, from being maybe small prototypes and so on. And I think that whole thing is definitely also the case with digital design and doing, of course, a lot of visual screen things, but just as much all the invisible things that we as designers of digital products takes a lot of decisions about. And maybe James now it's one of those. So of course, when it comes to the digital design, we are very, as designers, commonly work with what we can see, like what is visual and what we can hear and maybe feel. So we have, of course, also pixels and screens and physical materials when it comes to most digital products that are very common these days. But there is another set of materials as well, these more invisible materials. And I think, which is, for example, connectivity and data and this intelligence, which is a very fluffy word, but it's definitely something that is present in most digital artifacts today. And how to, as a designer, get a good gut feel of working with those things, it's much harder, I would say, than, for example, the physical ones, where we have a very direct feedback from how something looks or appears and sees. So if you click again, James.
I was just adding that the pixels and physical materials, they largely are parallels or emergent from previous mediums that over the last 100 years, 1,000 years plus, that we've been comfortable with in terms of different visual mediums, and we've inherited all of the principles along the way there. But these new materials, these invisible ones, it's very fresh for us to develop principles. It's something that is of this age and generation that we need to apply and establish practices and ways of working with these materials.
And if we look at the tool chains that we as designers often have been used for designing those things, it of course has been a lot about the UI. And I remember doing a lot of UI work in Photoshop back in the days, which was very static, and you had one specific screen size, and then of course there needs to happen a lot of magic to make it suddenly behave correctly and adapt to different mediums. And that's where I think, at least in a very mainstream way of working with design, digital design, is a gap between the design work and implementing the design and making it real and alive in the mediums where we experience them. But what we also see, especially over the last years here, are the design tools adapting more to those needs. So, for example, here is a few screenshots of the Figma tool and some of the tools you have available. And a lot of this is much more closer to code and the rules within programming and that behavior. So, for example, auto layout or making content dynamic and so on. And that's I would say a signal now that tools are starting to mimic more of these rules and characteristics of the digital medium. So we are already seeing a big what can you say movement there, where designers are getting closer to the material, but still with some layer in between. So it's not the real thing yet, but we are definitely getting closer to that. And having that in mind, looking back at the history of programming paradigms and tools, it's quite fascinating, especially for me that I'm 29 years old, so I haven't had the what we say been part of really experiencing the development of how software is created through all back from where a lot of stuff happened here in the 60s. But it's quite crazy to see a lot of these ideas and prototypes of how writing software could be done, and being very visual and using a lot more of the what can you say the tools we know, from if that is drawing or direct manipulation and so on. And at this time, programming was also very new and fresh. It could take many different directions. So there was also a lot of ideas because of that, I would say. And if you click the next, James, we have a better image of what actually happened with that evolution. And to be honest, over this evolution of 100 years, it's definitely a lot of stuff has happened to the computational power and what the mediums can do, but the way we make these instructions to the computer hasn't really changed that much. Maybe if we take a bit of a bird view on it, it's still today mainstream text dump from top to bottom in a way that looks like nonsense if you don't have spent a lot of time in this world already.
And I think I'm going to change gears here a little bit, and as Tor was saying, like, a lot of things have stayed the same for a while, and we had this explorative period starting in the 50s, and for a couple of decades there were computer scientists really exploring new ways of articulating and creating code, but there was an efficiency aspect of the kind of high-level programming languages that emerged, and the code-based programming languages that emerged for us, and that seemed to scale quite happily for a while. But something that scaling factor has hit a limit, and there are all sorts of various Forrester and Gartner reports. But they all speak to the same emerging trend in the software industries, and that's a very large category, which is essentially every industry, the software industry, and largely that need skilled workers. But the estimations now look like by 2030, where there's a skilled software creator shortage of 85.2 million people. And some of the estimates on what that means for the company's bottom line is a $8.4 trillion revenue risk. These are multiple Apples or Amazons, or just millions of small businesses, all at risk here, because the digitalization and digitization of businesses is at risk, because there's just not enough people who can create code out there. And whether we come from a background as digital artists, or are looking to do our own startup, or work at an NGO and doing design, regardless of the sort of principles behind it, this sort of financial and economic shift and pressure is going to catalyze change, and is catalyzing change. across how software is learned, how software is developed, and fundamentally who is creating software. And that's inclusive of probably nearly everyone on this call. And fundamentally, we can't scale the number of software engineers and people going through comp sci programs. 4 years is too much time to bring out skilled people. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no place for software engineers in the future. Quite the contrary. That need will continue to rise, but it just means that we need that, or rather, the world and sort of the economic world will demand more people participating in software creation. So what has emerged alongside of this? One of these trends is no code and low code platforms. And this is not I don't have you all in the room with me, but if I were to do sort of a poll of hands up, I would guess that nearly everyone has touched some sort of low code or no code platform over the last month, if not week, if not today. Particularly with the creative groups where you see website and web app builders, and you might use Wix or Squarespace or Webflow. You could go so far as to say something like Figma with its prototyping capabilities becomes a no-code platform and replacing some of the what otherwise would have been needed to be prototyped in code just a few years ago. And so these are emerging extremely fast. These are largely all very new platforms. And then the list of low code platforms, which require some level of code, but give you more of a visual way of working through that code and those interfaces. An even larger number of those are on the table. These are much more enterprise facing often. But this is what we're seeing emerge in terms of the tools and giving people the power to work with this medium that is not just the traditional code-based way of working that Tore was alluding to. And we can also see that there's this evolution of programming. Now, I think the linear scale that this image represents is maybe not exactly true, but where we can see it was where we came from machine code and punch card prior to that, to low-level programming, to high-level programming. The majority of programming is still done through this high-level programming today, and really looking at Python and Ruby and JavaScript. But largely, we are seeing this shift, and more people move into low-code and no-code spaces, and things that you might not even think of as no-code truly are, and the flexibility of these platforms are emerging. Not only that, it's a little bit like the electric car emergence, in the sense of the actual paradigm of the car itself can change the medium, the way that the visual representation of code and the logic and these invisible mediums can change drastically, in the same way that an electric car, you get rid of the drivetrain and you can get rid of the steering wheel for self-driving car, though the concept of the car is completely different all of a sudden. So, okay, now we're getting into some different perspectives here, but the question is there room for a new Bauhaus that is around software creation, that involves some of the principles? So just by way of looking at this from a different perspective, if we kind of recall some of our art history and design history, Bauhaus was this art, design, and educational movement that came up about 100 years ago, and it was in the midst of the modernization of manufacturing, and it had a lot of political and ideological catalysts that helped bring this movement into play, which was a movement of connecting craft to art, of working with medium, of being multidisciplinary, and was embracing modernist principles along the way. And so we can ask ourselves, 100 years later, now that our materials are shifting and our means of production and the demands of production are shifting, what happens to software creation? Well, we know that our code won't scale to fulfill the needs. who will be producing, how we're producing will have to shift. And our medium is largely, our material is changing, and our tools are changing as well. The call to arms around the Bauhaus was really this connectivity to craftsmanship. I'll just read this quote aloud. This came from the founder of the Bauhaus movement, but the art schools must return to the workshop. This world of mere drawing and painting, of draftsmanship and applied artists must at long last become a world that builds. When a young person who senses within himself a love for creative endeavor begins his career, as in the past, by learning a trade, the unproductive artist will no longer be condemned to the imperfect practice of art, because his skill is now preserved in craftsmanship, where he may achieve excellence. Architects, sculptors, painters, we all must return to craftsmanship. That's a very bold statement, and might not go so far as to say that every last designer now needs to embrace invisible mediums and become coders. But the opportunity is there for people working with software, with application development, with various other areas in software to start grabbing hold of software again, not code necessarily, but working with those mediums much more directly and without that layer that Tore talked about. And this will be a change not only on the practice on the vocational side in the workplace, but in the schools as well. And we're seeing this happen. And of course, over the last 100 years, the Bauhaus just left an indelible impression upon how we see design, particularly in industrial design and architecture, and all of these things came from this ability of this group and this school of thought and this ideology to combine craftsmanship with art, with design. And I would posit that we haven't seen that yet, or we're only starting to see that in software in a scalable way. And so we can look to some of the principles from Bauhaus and start incorporating that into the way we think, the way we approach software. Of course, first and foremost, that we're talking about today is embracing the new materials, embracing these materials into the way of thinking, and going beyond that, which is to break rules and experiment. A lot of schools of thought tell us around, if you're working with UX, that there are a lot of patterns that become established on web, in applications, and I think they're great. You know, there's a lot of patterns, and you should leverage those. But you could also say that some of the patterns are becoming very often repeated, that we're not, as designers, pushing the experimental aspect of these new mediums fast enough, of these new materials fast enough. How do we break some of the rules and experiment? Experimentation is very difficult if you're in a very slow process, but if you're hands-on with your materials in a new way, you can experiment much more quickly. And of course, that brings us to getting your hands dirty, understanding the constraints. Having worked in organizations across the world in the consulting and the design consulting side of things, and now with Noodle, unfortunately, you see just nearly 80% of design organizations, especially as they scale, they don't actually understand the constraints of the software they work in with themselves, and they're not getting their hands dirty. This is something that must change, and in order for designers to be relevant, for those organizations to be competitive, this has to change as well. And so again, there's this callback to how do we embrace these materials moving forward. We've started to experiment with an idea called design programming, and this is not necessarily just talking about visual programming that Noodle provides, but it's looking at how can we create programming languages that enable a design-driven approach that can be based in principles. And so I'm just going to share with you some of the principles that could drive a design programming movement, and when identifying a potential design programming platform that would echo some of the principles that you might find in sort of this Bauhaus ability to have a designer return to craftsmanship with software and software creation. One would be the enabling of creative practitioners to have granular control over software development. Right now, this is very, very difficult to do. You can't deploy your own software. Often takes other engineers to be part of that practice. The platforms created leave level of abstractions that make this very, very difficult for us to do. How can we challenge this? The tools themselves can take very many years to learn. How can we create tools that are familiar and lightweight enough to be learned in days or weeks rather than years? And again, coming back to the idea of abstractions away from code, code is just one abstraction of software, of programming. How can we work with abstractions that are less symbolic and become more intuitive than code? How can this be something that we can understand a grammar of the logic, an understanding of bring with us our concepts of flowcharts and visualization into creating software? And how can we allow ourselves and other non-engineers to be in control from very early experimentation all the way through production and maintenance of software, to not be dependent on engineers? Again, looking at the changes and the demand of the amount of software that needs to be created or that would like to be created over the next 5 to 10 years, we won't have access to engineers to do all of these important parts that they have traditionally done in the past. So there is an imperative to produce platforms that enable more people to do this. And then how do we erase the boundaries between what a prototype is, which largely I would imagine many of the people on this call have been able to do in the past or do regularly on a daily or weekly basis, which is to create prototypes, create digital prototypes. But how do we create that boundary, erase that boundary rather, between the prototype, the effort that you put into that, and production code? Why is creating that prototype something different than the production itself? Why do we have to create interactive artifacts twice in order for them to scale and to be usable? And how do we essentially expand the designer's craft? Of course, the designer over the last 20 years or so, design thinking and the idea of working with Post-its and mental models has expanded and got traction, and there's a craft in that. But in some way, there's been you create these boundaries that says, well, designers aren't the ones who create software. Maybe we prototype. But how can we expand that craft to actually be more hands-on along the way? The good news, I think, in this is that this is not just a manifesto. It is more of a recognition of what's happening today, and we are seeing new programming paradigms that are getting lots of momentum. Tore, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. And I think especially the gaming industry and music industry have really been evolutionary this for many years already. And especially looking at the Unreal or Unity have made these very sophisticated tools to bring in game designers to work directly with very advanced concepts of, for example, the behavior of an in-game character that needs to have a specific behavior in a scene, which is, of course, extremely complicated from a coding perspective, but providing the tools to actually iterate and work creatively with such some behavior is one really good example. And I think game is also, this way of working with node-based tools in the gaming industry is also what inspired the early seeds for Noodle to bring some of that into the world of web development and more traditional programming. And then, of course, we see a whole new generation of tools that are targeted towards younger audiences. So, for example, Scratch here, which also brings a much more expressive language to working with logic that allows much younger people to get hands-on and get experience of what it means to make the computer do something that you decide what should do. And then, of course, the whole low-code, no-code area that James already talked about, where we have typically it's very specialized tools that are very tailored to do a specific task, very well and focused. So the amount of time it takes you to learn a new tool can be minimized to do that specific task very well. And then, of course, there is all these mediums between, and there's a tool like Nodes.io. I think it's also a former CIID student that is behind that, which is trying embracing this because, of course, the regular way of coding, text coding, has a lot of benefits and also definitely a place there, and starting to mix around how can we take the best of both worlds and start to mix it up is also another approach we start to see.
And so we think at Noodle we're starting to embrace a lot of these similar principles that Tore just talked about here as well. And as Tore mentioned, Noodle came from a place of inspired by the gaming industry, and it was based on some of the principles of working in real time, allowing not only engineers to create full stack software, but allow non-coders to do this as well. The current state of Noodle is just so you know, it's a free tool that you can use. You guys are welcome to try it out. But it is, it goes beyond in many ways some of the the web flows. There's a much more flexible horizontal platform for creation. For us, it's important that we are not limiting what the designer does, that it is design driven by vision, by the product designer, by the startup founder, by the designer, by the engineer who doesn't want limits. Whomever is using it, we don't want to impose limits on it. Currently today, Noodle works in web apps, in web technologies. In the future, it might go beyond that to work. We can also work with IoT and prototyping and beyond. One of the great things that I'm very proud of in Noodle is that it brings people all the way from prototyping and just sketching, and this idea that you can create high fidelity interactive design materials in minutes that is the same as production, that is based on that principle of production and prototype really don't have much distinction, and particularly in those early phases, and brings people through a process of prototype to experimentation, of new types of collaboration out to launch in market. And there have been a number of cases of startups that do these highly robust backends, very large product catalogs, and release on Noodle, and really not driven by an engineering founding team. There are toys that are interactive IoT toys with AIs. And they're building on Noodle to actually do their AI engine, and how the responses are constructed for their tools to build different scenes, and that whole tool is built within Noodle. And then there are larger companies on the enterprise side of things that build their tools with Noodle as well, and also companies like Nike and others. I had some videos, but we'll skip them for now. So we want to actually just kind of wrap up by doing a demo hands-on of Noodle, and I'll stop my my sharing here if I can, and hand it over to Tore. But just as a quick wrap, we believe that this kind of looking to what happened in Bauhaus is a very positive thing for designers, for design educators, for companies, in terms of the expectation of where designers need to be over the next 10 years and how they will engage with software specifically. It's particularly important if you are working or leaning towards an area of application development and application design today to start challenging the expectation on roles that you may have seen yourself as a singular designer who works with the majority of time in post-its. And that might exist in large enterprises for a while, but it's going to change surely over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of the demand to work hands-on. If not for you as being a smart, creative person who should be hands-on in those later phases, then for the reason that there simply won't be developers to do that work. And there will be an expectation that that happens somewhere along the line. Tore, do you want to jump in with a quick look at what we're up to?
Yeah, I think you need to stop your sharing first before I can.
I've really.
It's also a very big picture of myself as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Just to help me a bit here, do you see my screen now?
I see it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's right. So I'm just going to make a brief demo here of Noodle, and this is the dashboard where I have a bunch of projects. And what I'm going to show here is sample projects that comes with Noodle. It's a very classic to-do list app. And yeah, Noodle is a node-based tool that abstracts JavaScript and React code into these blocks of nodes. And we basically have different categories of these nodes, which you can tell from the color, to represent visual things like HTML, or green ones that is data, and a bunch of others to kind of build your app in that way. So it becomes like assembling these blocks of visuals and logic and data to create your experience. So just a quick example here with the to-do app. It's made out of a bunch of different components, like a header component, a to-do list checkbox item here, and then input to do that. And if we, for example, dive into the header here, we can see we get into a bit more of a low-level view where we have a container, where we have a blue background color. So there's a lot of properties to style these, and that can be done with direct feedback, of course. We can also launch this on our phone via the IP and see the manipulation directly on the device if we prefer to do that. And then, of course, we have control over these different elements. And if I go back here and say, okay, now we talked a bunch with low code and no code, you can click that one. And I don't know if it's visible from your screen here, but this green node here is right now getting data down from a backend, which comes with Noodle, where this data here is being saved and updated. So as I click these, you can, maybe it's a little.
Yeah, we can't see your preview screen, unfortunately. That's one of the limitations of Zoom sharing on Noodle.
Yeah. Okay, so
you could do it in the canvas. So Tore currently has a little preview screen of the app running, but unfortunately Zoom only captures the one.
Okay.
The one maybe you can share your entire screen rather than the.
Yeah. There's also a question here in the chat from Nilank, who's asking, have all components been created in Noodle 2, or have you imported a design system?
So to answer that one, Noodle comes with a bunch of pre-made components, so like button and checkbox and drop downs, and they come as you see in the picture on the right here, and can be customized in many different ways. So that's what we normally use to build the UIs. It is possible also to import external UI kits like material, and we had that in the past as well.
And right now we have some basic imports from Figma as well, so you can more quick. I would say it's more of an asset import than a full library import at this point. So it's easier to get your assets from certain design files into the platform to start your layout work from.
I'll just see if I can do it on the desktop instead here. Is this better now?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so what I was doing before was just clicking off this checkbox here, as that will be visible in the data flow that we see here. So, for example, if I add another task here and add that, we see that popping in via the connection here.
Because this is one of the principles of trying to visualize data and visualize those invisible materials into the tool itself, and also to erase real time or make sure that it's not there's no cycles between deploy and create, that you're working more directly, almost as if we go back to one of the first slides of you're working with carving that chair, working on the lathe directly with the material itself, so that those changes propagate in real time as frequently as possible.
Yeah. Another example of it is how you can see this is now I'm inside the checkbox component, where we are getting again the state from the backend that remembers if it was checked or not checked, and as we interact with it here, we can see that Boolean state being put into the checkbox, and when we change it out again into a data node. So that sums up, I would say, the basic model of how Noodle works, of connecting different blocks of logic and visuals and data, and being able to all the time see where it's floating within your application, and having that real-time feedback. Then on the left here right now, you see there's a lot of different modules that you can get into, and a very important part of Noodle is how you might start with a set of core building blocks, but you can keep extending depending on what you're trying to build. So if you want to work with GraphQL, or if you want to work with let's say the web camera, you can load them in, and it's also possible to write your own modules with our SDK. So just to very quickly show here, for example, with now I got that webcam in. So if I place it here, I get a new node with the webcam. Then I can place, let's say, video one here, which is used to just display video. And I'm just going to make a few layout changes to how that will display. Connect from here the media stream from the webcam to the source of the video. And let's see, could do this here. Now, if I refresh this one, hopefully, if everything is working, I see myself in the header now. And if I want to bring back some of that blue color, change the blend mode. So yeah, just an example of how quickly it is to mix different technologies together, and be very iterative.
Or do you want
do experiments?
Why don't you deploy that into a sandbox and then see if others can enjoy that? It's always a bit of a demo risk, but we'll so there's one of the things that's built in is not just having your local prototypes, but in fact, there you go, having sandboxes and bringing your custom domain and things like that. So now if you go to this link, and I guess you could just put that in the chat, hopefully.
This is a different live experiment. Oh,
yeah, we've never done this one before, so we'll see if it works. You should be able
the
to.
wrong. Oh, I just forgot we got this new weird. That was the wrong one, actually. Okay, that's actually fine. Let's call it something. Yes. See if that works. But that's another way of very quickly getting what you're creating out in a shareable format to try on different devices, that we have that quick deploy. So just another thing that I believe could be interesting for you to see is also how Noodle can easily be integrated with more custom code. So for example, P5.js is a JavaScript framework library that I've been working with a lot, and I assume you might also use that a lot at CIID. So there's another node type here in Noodle, which is for custom code, which we can open up, and here there is the basic P5 sketch code structure with the setup loop and the draw loop. And you can do, of course, whatever P5 or JavaScript you want to do in here, and then hook that up to a group in Noodle, which then becomes a canvas. So as you can work with P5 as part of your UI, you can build everything around it in Noodle. So for example, down here, I have a Noodles or slider created with a Noodle node, which directly can be connected as an input to the P5 sketch, and then start to merge those two paradigms, for example, together. So that's another way of, and strength of Noodle, I think, how you can, if you hit some kind of a limit or limitation, you can always bring in a block to write your own code and very seamlessly hook that up to the rest of the Noodle system.
Where Noodle's at today is it should be usable by somebody who is comfortable with some level of abstraction. If you've had experience with something like CSS or done some web development or Webflow, that's usually a good level to get started in on Noodle. It has a bit more technical height than some of the other very specialized platforms. That's one of the trade-offs that we think is important in the current state of Noodle, which is we don't impose design limitations on what you can do. And while we have some templates that you can get started from, what you're doing is not fundamentally limited to templates or predefined structures either. You should be able to, just as Tore has done, control in the course of minutes, control a 3D object to go to webcams, to go to more of a standard list view application form like the To-Do app. And that should be part of the tool set. And this, just as somebody, for any of you here who might go and try Noodle, it has a bunch of learning paths built in. And they are things that are perhaps unfamiliar to you if you've only worked with prototyping before, like working with data and working with databases. But we think that those are important lessons and important parts of the material of the designer to get to know moving forward. And so it might seem tricky or unfamiliar at first, but it's a pretty intuitive platform after spending a little bit of time there as well.
Yeah, maybe we should save the rest of the time here for Q&A.
I'd love to hear any questions or comments.
Super. Thank you, James. Thank you, Tore. I can't see any questions here, but I have more of a comment, I guess, rather than a question. I really appreciated the way that you framed what you're doing at the beginning by talking about the aesthetics of code and the aesthetics of experience in the same way that we think about materials when we prototype physical objects. And actually on Tuesday we had a lecture from Matt Jones, and he was talking about the motivation for designers to go from designing from the perspective of fear, so being afraid of something, to a perspective of hope. And I think when you showed that we're going to need so many people who can code in the future, which is just not possible by the current educational standards, by designing these kind of tools or creating these kind of tools, you're actually democratizing code in a way, in the same way that media has been democratized by tools like Twitter, and Arduino has democratized the ability for people to create interactive prototypes by kind of lowering the barrier of entry for designers to actually design for themselves and not need to learn such technical languages from the very beginning. Also, some of the language that you used as well, I found very interesting when you were talking about going from being very technical and time consuming to being light and intuitive, about enabling and allowing designers to move forward with programming and code themselves. Yeah, we're friends with the people at Unity as well, so it was nice to see examples from them, another Scandinavian bevy of people there. And also the fact that you mentioned children, because I think increasingly, you know, when we look at what children are able to do, it's kind of scary, the way that they interact with technology and this fluency that they have, just because they've been exposed to that really since day one. The level of entry, I think, is being lowered at the same time that new tools are being developed. So hopefully this gap between those who can code and those who can't code is being squashed, and eventually it will meet somewhere in the middle.
I think it's the idea of the democratization of tools is definitely part of our mission, and we have a phrasing of building platforms to enable a new creative class, and I think there is a term which I find that if you look into no code and you look at a lot of the terminology that's used by a lot of these platforms, they use the term citizen developer. And I'm of two minds of that term, because I think there's the citizen developer, which could be anybody, but I think probably the people in this forum, who in this conversation that we're having today, are really professional creators and professional developers, and they have the opportunity to make sure it's not just a trivial thing that you're creating, but it does take time, it does take effort, but you're using it differently. And if you use different tools, and if you use mediums, and if you come at it from a different process and perspective, you will create differently. So it's not only the fact that it empowers people, it's what we expect to see is something akin to what has happened with the democratization of media creation. So if you think about what you see streaming on YouTube today, if you went back 10 years and YouTube was there, you could have never imagined that the top streams are going to be game streaming, crazy TikTok, whatever videos there are, and nobody could imagine that. And I am hopeful, if we want to talk about hope, I am hopeful that we as participants at Noodle have no idea in 10 years what people will be creating, but it will be different and it will be empowered, and that is the shift that we are part of. That is an integral part of my hope anyway.
It's always good to have a hope, James. Okay. We have a question here in the room from Mark, and then there's a couple in the chat, so we can take Mark first, and then we can make our way over to the other questions. Mark?
Hi, James and Tore. Really interesting what you all presented. I was wondering, like, what are the challenges to creating this tool? Because it looks really complete. And I mean, what are you expecting on developing on the future? Like what limitations have you encountered, and what are your hopes for developing this tool you're introducing just now in the future?
Yeah,
thanks for the question. I think one of the biggest challenges, as I see it at least, and James, you might have other perspectives on that as well, of course, but is this the balancing of flexibility versus making it accessible or easier to use, because it's always a very hard trade-off. You see a lot of tools that are quite easy to learn, but you also very quickly hit limits or constraints, because it kind of comes as a sacrifice that you move away complexity and very often also capabilities to make it more simple. But something that is very important for us with Noodle is also that you don't hit those limits, that it's really open for weird experiments and tinkering things together, and that doesn't really align with a very predefined path of working, which you often see in tools with I would say higher abstraction levels. So finding that balance is something we talk a lot about almost every day. How to be flexible enough, and yeah.
And related to that, I would say is just acknowledging that everything is created in an ecosystem today. I mean, Tore went through several different third-party libraries just in the course of a few minutes, and we should never expect that all of those third-party integrations will work in the same way as Noodle does in terms of the levels of abstraction, and that there will be points where, for a long time to come, where code is required in order to take advantage of those platforms or other business processes. We're dealing with large enterprises who have funky server configurations and enterprise requirements, and those are really unsexy things to deal with. But at some point, as Tor was saying, the reality of going to your production environment, we're going to hit those things for a few years to come. Now, on the exciting side of stuff, that's all boring stuff, and we hope to check those boxes. Is essentially, trying to make sure we continue to build the right level of all of these UI components on top of data. How do we make sure we make data more understandable in the future? And I think we've come a long way. I think we're pretty unique in that aspect, but at the same time, there's always more. There's going to be more to go for a while.
Okay, we have a comment and a question from John Lynch in the chat, and then we'll move over to Mia. So John, I don't know if you want to ask the question yourself, or do you want me to go ahead and read it?
I'll go for it. I'll say hello. Thanks, Ali. Mike, I just commented that this talk has kind of opened my eyes to something I'd lost track of. I used to code, and thank you for sharing that these tools have developed so well. And I'm excited for Noodle because I can't bear the idea of doing a hobby coding in the evening after a day of looking at the screen doing, but to be honest, is mostly PowerPoint. So yeah, that's been really helpful. But I wanted to ask if there's any advantage in these environments to having a sense of things like variables and arrays and classes, because in the demo you showed, none of those words came up. So is it true that there's it's null and void information now? You can go in here and play without an understanding.
Yeah. I think it's something that differs from tool to tool, of course, and the level of abstraction chosen. But actually in Noodle, that we have a node for objects, a node for arrays, and a node for variables. They were not visible in the views, as I don't think they were needed maybe in what I showed. But in our case, at least, it's very handy, of course, to have an idea of what those concepts are. We have probably made a little abstraction to them, or lifted them a bit up to make them easier to work with, but it is the same concepts as you would be used to from code.
So I'm not completely written off.
No. If you were a back-end guy in the past, I think you'll love Noodle in particular, because it gives you front-end superpowers, and you can still bring in the back-end knowledge for sure.
There's hope for you too, John Lynch. Hope for you too. We'll hand over to Mia.
Hi guys, thank you so much for this talk. I loved the Bauhaus references. Because I was an art history major, so I never get to see some of the things I know in design in this way. But anyways, I guess I have because of that, I'm like a novice coder. I'm an IDP student, so my eyes have been very much opened this year in so many ways, especially when it comes to programming. And also more visual programming. And I guess just from my limited perspective, some of the tools that we've been exposed to throughout the course of the IDP are obviously Figma, but specifically origami. And we didn't really touch Swift, but I just was wondering, because you guys did so much kind of great outlining of the ecosystem, I guess from a business perspective, how do you see Noodle competing against other products like origami or like Swift that do visual or no code programming and are also around kind of web and mobile prototypes? And how do you guys, I know you guys have been kind of answering this throughout the talk, but just if you could talk about what's the advantage of using Noodle versus origami. Kind of sucks in general because it's very slow, but yeah, if you could just talk about that.
Yeah, it's actually a great question, and I don't think we addressed it directly at all yet. So Noodle was born out of a place where we were doing mostly prototyping with that platform back at top. We would run, proof of concepts and things, but it excels for people who are doing in prototyping. It excels for if you are doing what we largely classify as advanced prototyping, or things that you want to be creatively out of the box and not use standard paradigms and patterns for your prototyping, in the sense that it is very limitless, and the ecosystem is very easy to connect out to other things and use for connectivity and IoT through MQTT brokers and different protocols and so on. But I would say if you're choosing just a prototyping tool, if you foresee a career in only prototyping, particularly on just sort of screen-based stuff, there are other tools that you can optimize around those use cases for, and I think we want to live alongside them. And if you just look at the prototyping perspective, it's not an either or standpoint. If you want to use some of the other prototyping platforms, and I would say that for our screen-based prototyping, the Figmas and Adobes and those guys, they're going to continue to get great on the prototyping side of things for screen-based experiences. They'll hit limits so when you want to start doing real deploys, and I think we think that in some cases that delineation between prototype and production is too distinct. That in order to do things like user testing, deploy things of dynamic experiences, that you need to be able to deploy an experience. And then a prototyping tool in the classic sense won't ever live up to that, because it depends what you're prototyping. Is it the UI? Lots of stuff for UI. Is it for data? Not a lot of options. Is it for dynamic experiences, personalization, getting in AIs? There's not a lot of options out there, and I think that's where I think others will catch up in different ways and be specialized in the prototyping of that experience. But if you're to choose Noodle for prototyping now, that's where I would recommend you choose Noodle, because it's the dynamics in different ways that you want to test.
I'm just keeping my eye on the time here. I know
Oh yeah.
but there's a question in the chat from Neelank. I don't know if Neelank, do you want to ask directly, or should I read it out?
Thank you, Ali. Hey, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. I'm really looking forward to try this out. I'm a design technologist from India, and a core responsibility in my role is being a bridge between the designers and the developers. And that also brings up the question of documentation. So is there some kind of a feature or in Noodle that helps us document or create like a functional wiki for the app or website being created? Or is it on the roadmap or something? Yeah, thank you.
What's interesting about Noodle in its current state is that, first, the quick question is no, it doesn't output sort of a documentation or annotation that comes with it. There have always been ideas of outputting sort of screens and flows around it. What's been interesting is that Tore worked on this project in the top days just a year and a half ago or so, which was a proof of concept of Walmart's mobile shopping app. The one you see today was completely built in Noodle and tied into their backend, and all of the business logic done prior to the big production phase. And then Tore worked on that one. What was interesting was all the comments we got from the internal dev team was like we cut the time down massively for their specification and requirements gathering just by using Noodle in that early definition phase. And partially because of the output of the prototype or the proof of concept itself, but also because the visualization of that logic in the actual Noodle editor becomes a spec in itself, because you visualize, while you build it, you're visualizing logical flows. So it's not exactly an answer to your question, like as far as a documentation tool goes, output, but that for complex scoping and production at that level, using Noodle in that early proof of concept phase as a functional essentially as a functional requirements document actually has proven itself time and time again as a very good approach.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, one last one, and then I promise we will let you go. So another question from Mark here. He says, I also wanted to ask, does Noodle provide a more realistic user test? Because I see that connecting data and prototyping is way easier.
Yes. If we keep it short, yes is the answer. Yeah. So I mean, you have to make sure that you are building your prototype proof of concept, what have you, with the appropriate data in there. But you can do dummy data. We have integrations to things like Google Sheets, so you don't have to be a super database guy in order to get dynamics in that data up and going and drive your experience. We have a couple of tools that you can use for that user testing. We have Google Analytics integrations that allow you to then look at the analytics. You can do the quant side of the user testing quite easily. One of our customers is GSK Innovation, working on consumer healthcare. They actually, instead of doing prototyping, they just launch pilots. And they're able to get a lot of user data back by doing that, and they work with different variants and start measuring the success at that level. However, at an individual scale, what you can do is actually do real-time development almost with your user. So if you have more of a friends and family, 10 people, recruitment, you can run many more variants at a high fidelity much more quickly. You can also do them, and I would say one of the biggest strengths is the fact that of what Tore did was to create that sandbox environment or to output to a URL. It's much more easy to distribute your screen-based prototype around the world wherever you want, and do that and collect that data or collect screen recordings remotely, or ask questions along the way, but allow people to use that in the real context is without you holding their hand or having to walk them through the fact that it's pretend this data is here or there. So lots of reasons why you can get better data off of it, but you have to update your process a little bit and choose which process you want to update.
Thank you. I guess one last question before we close is, if people want to noodle with Noodle, is there a free trial, educational allowance?
It is free, as in free. Go download it. It's not limited to students. Go ahead and keep using it. There are prices when you essentially start scaling and become very successful with your application. That's where it would kick in. But honestly, even if you get to that point sometime soon, we're at a point where we want to see people successful, and you're free to ask for a free trial, and almost certainly we'll say yes beyond that. But most likely for anyone for the next 12 months, all of the next, if you get started with it now, build your startup on it, it'll still be free. So give it a try. We want mostly we want you to be successful, and we would love your feedback along the way too. And there is a Discord community, which I would encourage you to join if you download Noodle. And we are happy to provide one-on-one support through that community. It is a new paradigm, a new way of creating software for a lot of people. We do not hide the fact that it can be tricky at first. So the learning curve is sharp, but it's pretty short. And we want to help you through that short, but sometimes tricky upfront learning curve. So don't hesitate to ask for help, and you'll get some one-on-one support.
There we go. Spoken from the perspective of a perpetual co-founder. Thank you so much, James. Thank you, Tore. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today, albeit on Zoom. Next time in Costa Rica.
So.
Thank you to everyone who's attending, wherever you are. Enjoy the rest of your morning, your day, your evening, and hopefully we'll see you on the next talks in the lineup. Thank you again. Take care. A round of applause for you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.